Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce the lunch talk for this Tuesday session. We'll be hearing from Jess Dempsey, who is the Deputy Director at the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope, and she also served as the lead on the ngEHT Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team, which worked on a climate survey for the EHT. And I hear, or I understand, maybe she'll correct me, that she also has connections with another EHT site, the South Pole. I believe that she was there for some period of time, even wintering over, which I did not know until I just happened to do a little bit of digging. So she and I shared that experience. I wintered over there as well, but much earlier than she did, I imagine. Anyway, so we're anxious to hear from Jess on this lunch talk. And hold on a second. Well, I don't have a title for it. Jess, do we have a title?
Yeah, I get to make it up. I'm going to take us all sideways into ethical astronomy with ngEHT.
Okay, so here we go sideways. Hold on, fasten your seatbelts, and welcome, Jeff. Take it over.
Thank you very much. Yes, I hope everyone has some lunch or breakfast or dinner in front of them. I'm going to take us in a different direction, just for sort of a palate cleanser before this afternoon's talks. So I want to talk about how ngEHT can save the world. And I'm going to talk about why we need to have a very honest look about where astronomy is sitting in the world right now and what we really do have to do to change how we situate ourselves on a global scale within our communities, and then also looking outside of our communities, given everything that's going on with the world right now. So what do I mean by ethical astronomy? We've heard of ethics. This is a system of moral principles. Ethics is concerned with what's good for both individuals and society. And perhaps the only way you might have come across it really routinely in academia is this idea of academic or scientific ethics. How you cite people, whether or not you shouldn't steal work, all of these things you will be familiar with. That's actually not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm talking about something far broader. We don't go into astronomy thinking that we are going to be anti-ethical in what we do, or that somehow astronomy is an anti-ethical practice in general with our community and society. And as a general, we don't really get systematic ethics training as a result. We're kind of at sea in all of these things. I usually get this request, this answer back from people, which is, why do we need ethics training in astronomy? We're looking up the stars, we're not hurting anybody. And I really don't think that that's something which is true. And I think we've had reminders of this here in Hawaii, very particularly starting in 2015 with its first TMT stoppage of construction. And of course, accelerating into July of 2019, where the entire of Mauna Kea astronomy was brought to a halt because of the Native Hawaiian protests against the 30-meter telescope, but also against astronomy in general became a target for the Native Hawaiian arguments against colonialism, against the inequities in their society. And we had some very hard conversations and some very important and very frank conversations with our local community as a result. We had some really shocking sort of answers given back to us. When we asked our community, who we lived on a tiny rock in the middle of the Pacific with, about the Mauna Kea observatories, they would say things like this: we don't know you. We don't see ourselves represented at any of the observatories of over 500 staff. No local people are hired there. It's all white foreigners. There's no opportunities for my children on Mauna Kea. And this is their sacred mountain. They felt there was this huge disconnect between us and them, and this started to sort of really make us look again at how our practice and how our work affects our communities. And here's an example of the deep underlying inequity that is actually at play when these sorts of protests happen. So the ALICE measurement, which goes one beyond this sort of poverty line measurement, talks about people who are asset limited, income constrained, yet employed with their hand to mouth. And if you have a look at the plot down here for the Hawaii Islands, you can see that in the areas which are crucially mostly Native Hawaiian local populations in Hawaii Island, over 70 to 80% of those populations and of those households are in this ALICE threshold. And so the imbalance from our institutions, which is echoed in these communities, and this is sort of between the people who are being able to drive decisions for the future and who have that agency and those in the community that don't have any voice, is what drives these really, people being pushed to the edge and to things like these sorts of level of protest. We also have a credibility gap. And I'm sure all of you have hit up against this more than once in how ineffective we are starting to be in communicating our scientific realities to the public. Fact-resistant communities with vaccine rejection and climate studies. And this gap and mistrust we're seeing is also coming now into the astronomy industry. And when we say something now, people don't believe us. And the last one is this disconnect that comes from our privilege. I don't think we have to, on a daily basis, think about our place or potential responsibilities to our direct communities. And especially when we're in these areas where these telescopes are, there are these large disconnects between the astronomy community, people who are at the observatories, and the people around us in terms of income, in terms of support and structures like this. And so because you are comfortable, you don't necessarily have to go that extra step for understanding these communities. And that's just sort of a human nature thing. And the thing I kind of point out here is people will say, well, that's Hawaii. That's not, these other places where we see astronomy. Maybe this isn't, something which is generalized or we have to worry about. So until the 1940s, of course, Europe and the US had the premier locations for modern astronomy. But as astronomy progressed, we went and needed higher sites: Hawaii, Chile, Mexico, Antarctica, South Africa. In other words, we started to have to depend on colonial locations to build our telescopes. And this is also true, of course, when you look at our ngEHT map. Now, did these locations get a good deal when these collections of nations came in wanting to build telescopes? With Hawaii, it was infrastructure money needed after the tsunami. Chile and South Africa, Mexico, all needed capital investment for a range of good reasons, but did they get in return what they were expecting? So if I took a plot here of the world-class current and future observatories, and the size of the circle here is simply just the percentage of telescopes in both the current complement of world class and also the future ones, including things like SKA, the ELTs. This is sort of the distribution that you currently see. Now the colors are the OECD Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient effectively looks at the inequity between the people who have a higher level of income and people who have a lower level of income. So if you have a low Gini coefficient in your country, more people earn roughly the same amount. And it's a fairer system. So it's a measure of the fairness or equity and how many people have a living wage, essentially. So what I've done here is color the circles dependent on the average Gini coefficients for the areas where these telescopes are. And what it comes down to is this, which is 75% of the telescopes of our current and future plans, and I haven't yet done this for the ngEHT, but it is a fairly similar distribution, are going to be in countries with high to extremely high income inequality. And there's another really interesting facet here, because if you want to talk about marginalized people, the indigenous peoples are usually the ones that are the most distressed and the most unequal. And if you then overplot here a map of the declared indigenous languages spoken across the planet, then in fact, 84% of the current and future observatories of the world are on indigenous lands. And I would argue that these inequities are starting to show the same cracks and concerns in places other than just Hawaii. So I think that this is a reality that we have to face, and astronomy has to in some ways effectively come down off the mountain, start connecting with its communities if we hope to have and establish lasting relationships and lasting projects in these areas. Can ngEHT change this paradigm? You have to reduce the risks, you have to accelerate progress, you have to improve your chances of success. And I do actually think that ngEHT has this unique opportunity to do that. So the first thing you need to do is start to connect through languages, cultures, and cosmologies. And there's a talk a little bit later by Professor Larry Kimura. I hope you get to see him. Very excited about that part of it. But the disenfranchisement of Native Hawaiians is not unique. 90% of languages and nearly every indigenous language will be extinct in 100 years. And language, it's an essential part of a collective identity. And when language dies, that sense of connected community also disappears. And so the tie-in, and this was with a community-born and a Native Hawaiian-led program of Hawaiian celestial nomenclature, and Professor Larry Kimura, who is known as the grandfather of Hawaiian language revitalization, started a Huahea Noa program. It started with Oumuamua, and this, of course, you'll all have remembered. And the reason you will have remembered it is because this went viral. Not just because it was this odd thing, and we won't talk about more recent controversies on this, but because also of the name. And it really did create a hook in people's imagination the way something with a number in it just really doesn't manage to do. And so the Huahea Noa program, which just means call forth a name, has been going leaps and bounds. It's now folded in numerous rounds of immersion school students, Native Hawaiian immersion school teachers. And now they have named 9 different celestial bodies, including some in our solar system, that have actually been accepted as the official names by the International Astronomical Union. Of course, here in Hawaii, for our April 2019 release of the M87 star image, Professor Kimura brought us this amazing gift of Pavehi, embellished fathomless dark creation as the name for the black hole shadow of M87. And I've shown some of you this plot before, but with the press release from Hawaii alone, this is the plot of the aggregate readership around the world. And that first bump, of course, is the April 10th announcement, but that second bump was the bump because of the discussion about Hawaii and the Hawaiian name Pavehi. Again, it really enters into people's minds in a different way. And when you start capturing imagination and the conversations about Native Hawaiian language and story, it's another way to close that credibility gap. So I think that ngEHT could expand a Huahea Noa and similar programs. You bring indigenous naming, local cosmologies to a global audience, and you perhaps get a focus of science and technology led by ngEHT to revive local communities and raise up indigenous voices. And this is a really resonant topic in a growing number of communities that ngEHT wants to explore. You have to trust what the community knows, what they need, instead of coming in from on high and saying, we know what you need and here's, we're going to hand it to you. Local communities need to be trusted that they know where their needs are. We need to change how we do what we call outreach. We have to change how we come in and what we bestow. And by learning from existing initiatives and aiding resource-poor nonprofits, you start to get relationship building in communities much faster. Here in Hawaii, we're looking at more local hiring, taking away the barriers to actually working for projects like observatories. That really has that community buy-in, because then it starts to be their project. Here, we're talking apprenticeship programs, culturally adapted curriculums, and non-science outreach community initiatives. So post-pandemic, we have to navigate these gaps. And in these community-led initiatives, you interweave these Indigenous ways of knowing, but they're not solving everything in and of themselves, but they start building a bridge. You need relationships, you need trust in order for projects like this to go anywhere, but especially in places which have tenuous economies. Now, this does take time. So how do we accelerate these relationship building and these trust exercises to get this going on the timelines that we need? Or by walking the walk. So we have a chance here in what we're talking about with ngEHT to interweave some of these ethical obligations into how we build our collaboration and our organization, and how we project that into the way we interact with our communities, both locally and then globally. We can be famous for our commitments to correcting the inequities in all of our circles. So an example would be by setting and meeting and then exceeding targets within EHT for gender equity, for representation, for recognition and opportunity for marginalized groups. If ngEHT becomes famous for that, that already becomes a, oh, we know that you've already worked on this for yourselves. We know that you're going to do good by our community because these are things you've already shown that you know are important to you. Using the vast ngEHT platform to amplify Indigenous stories not only captures imagination, but it builds trust in other communities when you come into them, if you've shown that you've had this respect and you've worked on this and you've had successes with this before. You set priorities of local hiring and training and education. And you then, it's going to have to be able to be adaptable, because each of these projects in each of the different locations needs to be evolved and owned and shaped by the local communities. And finally, if we don't recognize our responsibilities, not just to the next scientific outcome, the next discovery, we will perpetuate these social inequities, and we will increase our likelihood of failing to make these projects a success. And there are no downsides to seeking these kind of community relationships. It opens up public interest, it closes that credibility gap, and it leads to tangible returns. Local workforce development, education opportunities, they're actually smarter ways to run projects. Interestingly, it's now opening up new funding streams. There are governments, there are private companies that don't want to fund projects that are not aware of these things, that are not walking towards these things, and in fact are looking for those organizations that are actually seeking to do these things. And finally, it is the right thing to do. And so I think that for our evolving generations of budding astronomers and engineers, this is also going to be what attracts the best of the best to us, is if this is another platform upon which we build our collaboration across the world. And I did run through it fast because I want to start having a bit of a conversation and some questions from people.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jess. That's a very, it's eye-opening, it's challenging, it's a breath of fresh air. It's exactly what we need, frankly. And so thank you for sharing all that and for bringing it to our attention. Everyone who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand virtually. I'd love to hear from anyone while we're waiting for people to gather their wits about them. I'll ask the first question. Let me preface it by saying that within the ngEHT, we're completely committed to this idea of working with local communities. We're not just citing one telescope someplace, but we're citing many telescopes. And so it's very important that we do this properly. But well, what happens when you go into a new situation? I know this happened in Hawaii a little bit, where some of the local population thinks one way and some of the local population thinks another way. I mean, in other words, in Hawaii, it was not uniformly one way of thinking. So how do you approach that when there's divisions, perhaps even within the local community?
Yeah, and that's where polling the community and getting to know the community via agents of people in the community to say, we need entree into this and we need to meet as many people as possible. It needs to be on the ground. So I mean, I will hang TMT out to dry here a little bit. It was patently obvious no one from TMT wants to live in Hilo. No one wants to be here. And everyone can taste that, and they find that really, really insulting, by making sure if we're going to have people, in Namibia, somewhere in Africa, there have to be people in the ngEHT goes, I want to live there. I want to live and breathe this place. You have to be able to be willing to go and do that and immerse yourself, where right now, even in Hawaii, people kind of hold themselves separate. And it takes that kind of willingness to go and dive in. Then you find that spectrum of opinion. Then you start to understand where all those resonances are. You can bring people to the table and start to bring consensus. But just one trip, one couple of hours with 2 or 3 people, they might tell you everything you want to hear, but that is give you nothing or no sense of whether or not that's actually, the sentiments that are going to matter in the end.
Okay, thanks. Next is Saura. Do I have that right?
Yeah, hi, it's sort of. Yeah, Jessica, quite an amazing talk and a very important topic. So I have a 2-part question. First question is, what do you think how outreach activities can actually, be very much engaging, and how can actually one participate in such a way that we actually sort of try to indulge in those, diversity and, into that culture and, have some interaction in this thing. So what role outreach will play in this thing? And second question is, like all these big collaborations such as, CERN and LIGO and all these collaborations, they certainly do not have a very, let's say, short-term impact onto the society, contributions in the society in terms of, daily life of a people, like, searching for some renewable resource or, something like that. But, certainly they have certainly provided a long-term effect on the society itself, like CERN introduced the internet, right? I mean, so what do you think how ngEHT could actually be useful, and any sort of predictions from your side that can actually contribute to the human society in maybe short or long term?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
That's about a whole nother talk there in answering those questions properly. So I'll do my best. In terms of what our Indigenous communities and really threading through, what can they contribute back into our science? What I have learned from Hawaiian cosmology continues to inform my science. It is actually mind-blowing to me what I'm starting to learn from the community poll. There are so many ways where expanding how we describe and understand the universe from an Indigenous cosmology can start to inform our science. And I just now call it a tapestry, where the threads of what we're understanding now are just filling in existing bases of knowledge. And it helps to not just inform that, but when you present that to a public audience or to a new audience, they can see the tapestry and they understand it in a way that one of those different threads would never have done. And that's something that I think matters. And then I think in terms of the second part of the question, long-term contributions, ngEHT is going to have a footprint all over the world. How does ngEHT make that, for example, sustainable? We might have long-term contributions to the planet. What about contributions to the planet on short terms? I think that that's something ngEHT could do in the way that no other, CERN and all these other places, they have a tiny footprint they only have their little part of the world where they're at. ngEHT is everywhere. So I think it needs to have a bit more of a global look at its impact in the world and on its communities.
Okay, thanks. We have time for a couple more questions, I think. I believe, Michael, we were going to start the break at 12:35. We're going to eat in a little bit to the break here. Is that true?
Yep, that's right. It's fine to take some more questions. Yeah.
Okay, and after that, when do we resume?
So then we'll start the next talks as scheduled. So that'll be at 45 past the hour.
Okay, so 12:45. Okay, so Nick had his hand up first, I think, and then I saw Andrew Shale. Andrew, if you still have a question, go ahead, and then we'll go to Arturo. So Nick, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting, and I think an important topic. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how outreach connects to the credibility gap and how to sort of incorporate better forms of outreach to improve the credibility gap and also just, learn more about the people that we're outreaching to?
Mhm. I think one of the examples here is, and it comes back down to language and how we connect in our community. And that's to do with we having to translate, for the first time, we're translating our press releases. The first one ever into Native Hawaiian here in Hawaii was the Povehi release.
Mhm.
And we had people come back to us from the Native Hawaiian TV saying, we're going to actually now just ask for these releases to be in Hawaiian. And so this was just, it completely didn't even occur to them to do that. And that was a connectivity with our Native Hawaiian and our local community that they really appreciated. They just hadn't even thought to ask of it before because they just thought we wouldn't even care. And so we had to, and Larry will tell you, he has to invent words in Hawaiian for different concepts.
Right.
And so that's a way to bridge this, right? Which is suddenly you're having these resonances that you didn't have before through the medium of language.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew, I think you were next, and then Arturo.
Yeah, thanks, Jess, for a fantastic talk. I think you addressed this already a little bit, but I just wanted, if you could reflect a little bit more on it seems to me a unique challenge that we have in having so many potential sites and having this globe spanning instrument, and how does that, it seems like that makes it a lot harder to have this engagement on the ground in so many places at once. And so what do you see as the way forward addressing that?
Well, I think you have to have a success somewhere once. That's my first advice, is to smallify it and I would find one of the easier places to start this with, and set set the first sets of goals and targets you want to have at this site in terms of what are you going to do for sustainability of the site? What target are you going to set on local hires for the staffing that you need? Right? And there are 3 or 4 things you can do like that, and you can say, here is what we're going to do. You take that to a new site, and as you figure out how this works, you start to adapt and evolve, and you become more efficient and more sort of authentic, I think is the right word, about figuring out how to connect with your community. And it's embarrassing that we have to figure that out because that's kind of a normal human thing to do. I don't think that astronomers are very good at it, and so we just need to get practice. And the great thing about it is we need to be willing to adapt and go, wow, that didn't work. Okay, we can step back from that and figure something else out, and we evolve. And that's only going to happen with sitting in our communities and going, hey, here's what we want to do. And we may miss the first couple of times, but we're going to keep going at this until we figure out how this works. And I don't think that there's a lot of other technical projects on the planet that have the opportunity, and ngEHT does, to do that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Jessica and Andrew. Arturo, go ahead.
Yes, just quickly. Well, I'm also thinking on the how are we going to implement this, and then because well, some of you know that I'm working for the LNT, and the LNT has this experience along the years, more than 20 years now, trying to engage with the community, and it has been a challenge. I think that there are some cases of success and also failures, but I think that the main point that I want to raise is that we need to think that very carefully, and even thinking on allocating money to that effort, because in the practice, well, it is a huge effort that we have to put into this. And in the LMT side, we have worked a lot with the community along the years, collaborating with the local schools, with the communities, political entities, and it's a huge challenge. And then, yeah, I think that we are planning very carefully how we're going to implement our scientific project. And I think that the same effort has to be done for this other plan of engaging with the community. And I think that collaborating with other institutions working on the same things can help us to be successful in that regard. I can tell about the experience that we have with, for example, the Peace Corps here in Mexico, that this US-led initiative, we started to collaborate with them, and then they are helping, for example, in a specific topic, I don't know, maybe going to the schools to teach something in a specific, either mathematics, physics, or whatever. But I think that we have to come up with a very detailed plan to implement this. And that's my main comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Arturo. All good points. We'll take the. Well, Garrett, did you have a question? I see your hands lowered now. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just fantastic talk and a really important topic is something we all should keep in mind. What struck me was also, as we start thinking of site selection and our operating model, we want these sites to be, almost completely, or in some cases completely remotely operated, which just adds another challenge of maybe another element to this of maybe not always having a full-time staff of people that are traveling constantly to the site. Even more important to build up a strong local community and an institution that's going to be able that we can rely on, but also that will have buy-in and ownership of the site, because we're not going to be able to do and build and maintain an array like this globally distributed with like a centralized operating model. We need that partnership. And I guess my question is just, how can we get started, immediately on that, to be able to get that buy-in, but also to kind of start building the sustainable operations that we need for ngEHT.
Yeah, I mean, targeted educational focus in the areas and in places that you're about to put a telescope, right? You are gonna, and what do you need, right? If you're gonna create an ngEHT, a telescope kit, right? And then it has to come with also the educational kit to create that community that is going to build and run your telescope. That's totally doable. That's the stuff we're starting on with the apprenticeship work and the culturally adapted programs here. But you can package that. And it's exactly what you need to do. You're right, Garrett.
Perfect. Okay, so we're running short on time here. Aditya, you had your hand up, and then Peter, if you have a short comment, but we'll have to restart in about 7 minutes. So I want to give people a bio break as well. So Aditya, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the talk. So I had a question so the EHT had a collaboration with the National Society for Black Physicists, I think, that set up a scholar program for underrepresented populations. So do we have an organization like this that represents, let's say, Hawaiian scientists or young scientists that have Hawaiian origins, or an organization that advocates for their scientific interests? Thank you.
I'm glad you asked, not yet, but I hope we will. I mean, this is exactly one of the areas of focus that I would love to see in ngEHT, expanding from the work it's been doing with the Black Physics Society. We're talking about that here in Hawaii, is handing over telescope time to a Native Hawaiian entity that gets to choose what to do with that time. ngEHT could do something similar for Indigenous scientists, for local scientists, for underrepresented groups, for example. Like that would be an initiative like that, which could be very interesting. But yeah, setting targets for how we are going to accelerate the careers of marginalized groups with ngEHT is very exciting.
Great. And Peter, please.
So I just want to thank you, Jess, on behalf of not only the Equity, Inclusion, Diversity Committee, but of the whole of our new ngEHT collaboration and the EHT collaboration. You've done so much to help make these collaborations work in a welcoming, exciting, and forward-looking way. It's really a terrific honor to work with you. I think one of the lessons that you have conveyed to us is that we want to be talking with people, not to people, and that, you know, the outreach has to be accompanied by an inreach of listening, not just talking. And so maybe there are opportunities to find out, as you've stressed more than once, what people need locally, but also to convey cosmological and other views about the sights and the skies to us. And I just imagine how thrilling it would be to think about us learning about the cosmological and historical and contemporary philosophical views that these different groups all over the world have about the skies and parts of the sky that fascinate us and to which we've devoted our lives. So I just want to thank you, Jess.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so that seems like a good place to wrap it up. I'll just conclude by again thanking you, Jess, for taking the time to talk with us, and we need to redouble our efforts, and you all have my commitment that this is something that has to be front and center in the ngEHT as we go forward. Part of the draw of the ngEHT is that we serve as an exemplar, as a project that can bring people together to solve local challenges, and that's only going to work if we have credibility and if we have traction with people all over the globe. And so we should be dedicated and committed to that end. So thanks very much, everyone, for this very engaging session, Jess, and we'll reconvene in just about 3 minutes for our next sessions.